Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earthcare should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Hey, Earthkeepers. As you probably know, every now and then I feature an interview with an author about a new book. What you might not know is that I only do that with the books that I recommend. That is certainly the case with Leah Rampy's new offering called Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos. In that book, she explores what lies beneath our unwillingness to change how we interact with the natural world, but also what we can do to nurture deeper connections to our places. Leah, welcome to the podcast. I'm glad that we can have this conversation because I really love your new book, Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Crisis. I hope that we can give our podcast listeners a sense of what the book is about so that they too might be inspired to read it. If you were to try to maybe sum up the essence of the purpose of this book, how might you say what that is?
The question that I was pondering is, given the challenge that we have of climate change and species biodiversity, ecosystem losses, we are living in that. Given that we are living in that, how shall we live? How do we live in a way that we are fully alive, deeply connected, open and present to the grief and the loss that is, capable of holding that, bearing witness, and still find that joy, beauty, delight that is alongside of and within all of those challenges that we face? How do we do that? What does that look like for us? And how do we help each other on that kind of a journey? And how can we look to the living world to co-collaborate? How can we get sustenance and hope and connection? And how do we give that back? So that's what I was pondering. I really wrote it because I was trying to make my way through those kinds of questions.
When you think about your potential readership, who do you imagine might benefit from this book in particular?
Well, of course, I think you always start close to home on that. So I started with people who were attending my retreats and individuals I had collaborated with in classes. And they were asking the question of, what do we do now? And I think part of what I was trying to suggest in the book is it's just as important, or perhaps more important, to think, who shall we be now, than it is to say, what shall we do? There are a lot of books that talk about what to do. Then I also began to concern myself with individuals who are doing so much hard work trying to take a stand in these really difficult times. I have a lot of friends in nonprofits like Interfaith Power and Light, for instance, who I know take really important stands. And they work in the halls of Congress, and they work on the front line where there are really dire consequences for the kinds of loss and destruction that are imminent, and they're trying to hold the front line against it. So I was thinking of those people as well, because I think that work is so difficult and can be so draining if we're not thinking how we sustain heart and soul in those times. I'll tell you who I'm not writing it for. I'm not writing it to get into an argument about, is there such a thing as climate change? Are we facing species loss? I think that is resolved, and I'm not the best person for trying to convince people who haven't really absorbed that. If you're questioning it, this book might be really helpful to you. But I'm really wanting to talk to people who say, I don't know where to go from here.
Yeah, and I will tell you that in terms of how I received the book, it was a very nurturing book. I felt like there was compassion expressed throughout the book, and I received it that way. And so reading it was actually a kind of respite for me, kind of a recharging almost, just because of the things you were recommending in terms of connection, of soul awareness, of intentionality about what we're doing and why. So I really appreciate that restorative function of the book, I would call it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That was certainly one of my hopes.
Well, before we talk more about the book, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how your interests in earth care and connection to place were formed, especially some of the early influences.
I think my first connections to nature, to the living world, to earth was really because I grew up in the middle of Kansas, in the middle of a wheat field, surrounded by oil wells, pasture, wheat, and lots of open sky, few trees. So throughout, you see my deep connection to and respect for trees. Perhaps because there were so few, I craved them so much and really felt connected to them. So those early years were times that I spent outdoors, and stars felt brilliant and close, and weather was closely attended to because we were not on a phone looking up our weather apps to know what might be coming. I felt really privileged now, looking back, that I started my life in ways that allowed me to be deeply connected to the living world. And that was probably true for most of my growing up years. I don't know when it really came to me that I was desperate to be back more fully into the living world. But there was a point where when I left one of my later jobs and somebody said, "What are you going to do next?" I said, "I have no idea. I just know I'm going out to the farm and put my hands in the dirt." Somehow there was this invitation that drew me back to that, which I think is a separate kind of line from what drew me into being concerned about climate change and biodiversity loss. There's a separate line that is deeper and underlying all of that, which is this longing for connection to the world around me. And that's still present and important.
You're very generous with stories from your experiences throughout the book. In particular, I was struck by some of the accounts you gave us of your childhood spent on the Kansas prairie. I wonder, would you maybe read a bit of your book? I want people to hear the story, but also to get a sense of the poetry of your language, which I really loved and appreciated.
One of my early careers was teaching school. And for 10 years, I taught 5th grade, 6th grade, a little bit of 3rd in there. But the kids would know that if they sat quietly and paid attention and begged, I would always extend reading because not only am I enjoying writing, I love to read. So thank you for asking. I'm really appreciative of that. So let's find the story here. So this is speaking of my childhood. While hardly a budding naturalist, I grew up close to the earth, with other homes well beyond walking distance and no school options before the age of 6. Tire swings and chickens, stray cats were my companions. I walked dirt roads, fell into snowbanks too deep to escape without help, and heard the crunch as I walked across linoleum made gritty by the dirt from plowed fields blowing through the cracks in our country house. Sunflowers, wheat fields, rolling hills, and tiny creeks were all a part of the world I loved. Even after I moved east, it would take only one step back into that prairie view to know that I was home.
That's so beautiful. Appreciate that. Thank you. Your language is very evocative and very good at taking people into the experience to feel and smell what those experiences were like. Well, in Earth and Soul, you describe our current state of ecological crisis as a spiritual one, and a lot of our guests do that as well, as I'll point out. I'm curious, what do you mean by that, and what are the spiritual aspects of the current climate crisis as you see it?
I suspect there are several different ways we could come at this question, and I'm sure you've heard many examples. For me, the underlying concern, though, that makes it a spiritual crisis is that it's a crisis of separation. My spiritual journey tells me that what's important is oneness, unity in this living world among all beings and in the fabric in which we're held, that is a sacred piece that defines who we are and why we matter, is this overall sense of connection. So when we lack this understanding of oneness and we move into the space of separation, then I think it's very easy for us to other not only the living world, but all people who are not exactly like us. And we build those walls, literally and figuratively, of separation. And it's a short step then to power over, to coming from a place of self that dominates the collective. A concern for me over a concern for you. A concern for me over a concern for the whole community. So that sense of separateness, I think once we engage in that with the living world, it just follows that it becomes a way for us to continue our practices that separate rather than our practices that unite.
I want to pick up on a word that you just used, othering. I'm wondering if you could tell us how you're using that word, othering, and maybe even give us an example of the consequences of othering.
So we could take othering with a view toward, let's just say, forests. So if I see forests as less important than the rest of, let's just say, people, the forests are significantly less important than people. In fact, forests are here to serve us. That's the view that I take. And it's easy for me to decide to cut down forests. It's easy for me to decide to use the boreal forests of Canada for things like toilet paper, tissue, and paper towels because they don't matter. They are other. So what are the consequences of that? Well, we could say they're pragmatic consequences for all of the beings who live there, not only the trees themselves, but people who live there, the indigenous peoples who live there, but also all the animals and plants that are dependent on the forest. So we take out an entire system. And sometimes that othering is not an intentional, I want to harm. It's a thoughtless, I'm just assuming that what's good for me will be okay. I think it was Wendell Berry who said, that we have to flip that around. I wish I knew exactly his words, but he speaks to once we start understanding what's good for the world, then we will see that we have to prioritize that. That's what is good for us, is what is good for the living world. So I was making the step from doing that to the forest to say, well, but if I think that my tissues are more important than that living forest, and then they're more important than the people who live there, and then they're more important than the people who happen to live close to the mills that process that paper product. So now they are other than me, and they may not look like me or have the money that I have or the capacity for writing a book or whatever. So I think what I'm feeling when I speak about othering is distancing myself and prioritizing myself over you and over all other living beings.
And of course, this is the very separation that you focus your book on. Like, how do we undo the othering? How do we realize that we're not essentially other from the rest of creation, that we're part of it, that its destiny is our destiny?
And I think part of the challenge with this forest is we're missing that it's breaking our hearts. We're lonely. We know that there is an epidemic of loneliness. The U.S. Surgeon General called that out well ahead of COVID, which also lifted up the impacts of loneliness. And he has cited statistics about how loneliness is the equivalent to smoking how many cigarettes a day, and heart disease can be linked to loneliness and depression and anxiety, and the list goes on and on. Well, I think we kind of get that oftentimes we're lonely for other people. I think we really haven't come to terms yet that we are also lonely for those connections to that living world because we have maybe not been taught, we've forgotten, and it also is pretty inconvenient to recognize that. Because if I recognize that, I might have to change the way I'm living. And that might not be comfortable.
You used the term species loneliness in the book at one point, and on the one hand, we can acknowledge that certainly people on the individual level can be lonely if they're disconnected from the rest of creation, but species loneliness seems to mean something at a much bigger level. Can you describe what you mean by species loneliness?
Yeah, those are terms I didn't invent, and they are ones that are used by American Psychological Association. Species loneliness and eco-anxiety is another, and solastalgia, which is the loss of landscapes and land that we grew up in. For solastalgia, you might think mountaintop removal. I'm living now in West Virginia. That's a real thing. And people who grew up and had for generations stories of the mountain that they see in the distance and maybe walked there and hunted there and had that part of who they were, they are looking day in and day out at immense machines that are hauling away that mountaintop. That's mourning that doesn't go away. That's a loss that isn't the same as losing a dear friend because you're watching it over and over and over again. And that's what's the difference, is that scale. That's true of eco-anxiety. It's a scale of concern that is across people and time, and it doesn't go away. Same for the loneliness. Eco-loneliness is the sense that I'm disconnected and I can't find it back. I don't know my way forward. So part of what we're doing in this book, and I think probably part of what you're doing as you talk to people over and over again, is asking that question: how can we make those connections that are really heart and soul connections? This is more than I want to plant a tree because it will shade my house. I think that's important, and I think we should be doing that. And we should be looking at towns and cities where heat islands are incredibly, horrifically devastating the health and well-being of people who live there. So sure, we should do that. And there's more. There's more. There's this sense that I know and love and connect to this place, and that it is healing me because of my connections.
One thing I appreciate about your writing is that you are frankly realistic, and you don't really shy away from stating some of the hard facts that are leading to our dire situation. And I would say that, in fact, the subtitle of the book, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos, you talk about climate chaos as something that in some ways is here to stay, right? You're not talking about maybe an idealistic model that somehow we're going to bring us all back to Eden, that we'll somehow get back what we've already lost. But I appreciate the realism of your writing because I think it honestly helps me to trust your voice more, because you're speaking about things that we all know are truths that we live with. So I appreciate that. I wonder if I could ask you to sum up your stance about the current and future state of the planet. What do you mean actually by climate chaos that we're living amidst?
Well, in a way, climate chaos is a bit of a shorthand for me because, as you know, Forrest, it's not just climate that we're concerned about. If we were to stop all of the CO2 emissions and kept going with cutting down the Amazon and the boreal forest and the forests of New Guinea and Russia, we still would be in disarray because that is so deeply connected. All of those forests, just as one example, are so deeply connected to the well-being of the entire planet. They're cleaning the water, cleaning the air, making weather. we could go on and on about that. So when I'm talking about being amid climate chaos, I am saying, yes, that we have CO2 levels higher than we've ever had in 100,000 years. Yes, we know that we keep living in higher and higher average global temperatures. We see oceans that are hotter than they've ever been. We see melting glaciers. This is here. It's happened. We can't put the glaciers back any more than we can put back the songbirds that we've lost or the areas of the Amazon that have been cut to plant soy fields. We can't recover some of what we've already done. We can stop adding to it, and we absolutely, positively should stop adding to it. But we have baked in climate change for ourselves, for our children, for their children. It will take millions of years for Earth to recover what we have wrought. Now, that's not to say that Earth is not incredible. I mean, we know we've had 5 great extinctions. We didn't live through them, is the difference. And it would be really wonderful to try to see how we could minimize the suffering for ourselves and for all living creatures and for all those that are coming in the future. And I think that's what we're working toward, is how do we minimize suffering? And how do we, again, this goes back to how will we live when this is going on? We're already not wanting to do that. I've got great sympathy for wanting to look away. I totally get why we want to look away. It's hard stuff. And yet, I don't think that our souls grow because we look away from hard times. I don't think that we enhance our own well-being just by denying what is. And certainly, it lets us off the hook too easily for the work that we really need to do, which is hard work. My book is not to say, here's 7 things you can do and the world will be back to where it was, because I just don't see how that's possible.
I think the distinction is so important. You're not making the case that we need to reconnect because we'll save the world. That might be part of what results from reconnection, but in a way you're saying we must find a way to reconnect because that's how we were intended to live. This is about living the way we should live, regardless of the circumstances around us.
Absolutely. Yeah. How does that land with you?
Well, I think that's why I appreciate your book, because that is where I am as well. Honestly, I find that people who take a hope-only stance exhaust me in some ways because it's too hard to hold on to hope in the face of what we know is true about the world and the change that's been through already. But I also know that what got us here was a way of life that many human beings have adopted that has led to the crisis. And I just think that's the proof that this is not how we're made to live, that we need to be somehow reintegrated, reconnected, as you put it. I wonder, obviously the book is about reconnecting, and how do you see that as a response to the current crisis?
So I want to say something about reconnecting. So I want to say you could rightly challenge me on the use of that word, I think, because we never really can disconnect fully. That is impossible. We are breathing air. We are made up of the water that is in this earth. We are eating plants and they become our cells. I mean, we are in an ongoing state of communion with the living world. So in some ways, reconnecting is not exactly the right word, but everyone I tried really wasn't the right word either. So what I am saying is that we've definitely frayed our connections. They are not rich connections. They are there, but often unrecognized and unappreciated. And we are not, probably, I'm not suitably grateful for them every day of my life in the way that I would be if I was really recognizing that level of connection. And the whole concept of reciprocity is often missing from our dialogue. And that's one of the ways I honor the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer and writing Sweetgrass. I think she's really brought that term into our lives, into our consciousness, that we not just want to give back because we're grateful, but we have a responsibility because of the gifts we've been given to return those to Earth. So reconnecting is maybe not the right word, but you get the direction I'm going in. Let's weave stronger connections. Let's imagine what that might look like if we could be more deeply aligned and connected with each other.
You use the word kinship in your book a lot. And with my organization, Circlewood, we've been impacted by the teachings of our Native friends who have introduced us to that way of thinking about all elements of creation being our relatives. And so reconnecting means becoming a good relative, acting as a good relative as one would in a healthy family.
Well, I think we have so much to learn from the indigenous peoples. I'm thinking of Enrique Salmon, who wrote about concentric ecology. And I think that is so important for us to understand that the native peoples had a way of evolving with the earth. It was not, we won't harvest anything from the forest. It was not, we won't eat of this earth. It was that there was a co-living, a co-creating, a co-understanding of taking the honorable harvest is such a beautiful example of that, of looking at what is available, not taking the first because it might be all there is, not taking the last so you don't decimate it, not taking more than half, leaving for the other beings of earth. Wow. And then to do things like gentle burns in the forest that made them less susceptible to the gigantic fires and intense fires that we face now. And there were so many things we could have learned and still can if we are willing to be humble enough to recognize that there's so much we don't know.
Yeah, humility is key, absolutely. In your book, you're careful not to stay in the realm of the abstract in terms of ideals only. You talk about what people can actually do to nurture a connection to their places, to their ecologies, to the rest of creation around them. Could you give us a sense of, pragmatically speaking, what can people do if they in fact are convinced that, yes, I do need to reconnect, I need to be more aware of my connections?
I'm glad you said awareness because I think that's one of the most important things. First of all, right, it's an intention, and you said that. So the first is, I have an intention to at least explore this. I'm curious about it, and I want to explore for myself what that might be like, feel like, look like. And then how do I pay attention to what's going on around me? So I'm teaching a lifelong learning class at our university on this book. And so the first thing I ask, and it sounds a little strange, but the first thing I ask at the beginning of every class is, so what did you notice since we were last together? Because in our busy world, we walk along, I think, and do not see so much what's going on around us.
In the book, you use this phrase, tuning our five-stringed harp. You're referring to the use of the senses. And what came to mind was, it's one thing to read about the amazing mycorrhizal network under the forest, which links all things together, right? But it's another thing to go outside and turn over an old log to see the mycorrhizal network, to touch it, to put your face down close to the log and smell it, because it actually smells really good, right? It smells like the earth. And I think that those are practices that if we knew them as children, I think we have maybe grown out of them or maybe don't value them quite as much. But it seems to me that seeing with the eyes of the heart has a lot to do with all of our senses and engaging them very directly with the created world.
And I think as children, many of us did know those things. They're not particularly prized in most schools. Maybe just the opposite. We don't oftentimes invite children to keep exploring. We're in a hurry. We got time schedules. I look back in some sadness with my own children about the things they wanted to explore, but here it is like, come on, we got to get in the car and go. It's time to get to school. So that happens when you're blessed with really curious and tactile children. Follow them. They have so much to teach us.
So in your book, you raise what I think is a very important question about connection to the places where we live. And the thing that struck me was the dilemma that you raised, and that is, what if we didn't grow up in the places where we live? And I thought it was funny because you read this statement about living on the prairie, and you wrote, "To this day, being unable to see storm clouds gathering in the distance makes me nervous. A remnant memory of the many times I watched with my dad while roiling clouds formed shapes in the distance and the air hung weighted with silent expectation." I formed that image in my mind, and I feel pretty nervous, actually. Having grown up in Seattle, where there's mountains to the east and west, home for me means seeing the boundaries, right? It's feeling enclosed. So I thought it was funny that what you long for, living in West Virginia as you do now, was the wide open spaces of Kansas. So anyway, to each his own, but I think it's important to be, first of all, aware of our early connections to place. Because again, I think that we as children, we remember places that mean a lot to us because they formed us, they helped to shape us. And I do wonder, though, for people who in this mobile society have ended up in places that aren't their own technically, how can they actually nurture relationship to place, nurture connection to place?
Something I've been wondering about, and I explored that in an essay I wrote for a different book. I really went back and looked at my ancestors insofar as I could find them, and I thought, wow, nobody was ever settled. We're generations of unsettled. We were always moving on. Maybe a couple of generations would live in one spot, and then they were moving on to somewhere else. So I thought of so many of the indigenous peoples who've lived for generation, untold, and know that land, and the land holds memories, and the land knows them. And what are we missing when we don't have that? So it was kind of sad. I mean, it's really sort of poignant for me to think about not having those deep connections and not being able to live long enough in a place that I would be able to create them. So I had an experience in this class I'm teaching where we talked a little bit about that, and one woman was talking about a place that she grew up in. I won't go into all the detail about it that she did, but the comment she made was, if I were ever in a place where I would have to live on my own, it was almost as if she was saying, if I'd have to live in the natural world by myself, if I could go back to that place, I think I could make it because I knew it so well. So I find it both troubling, and then I also think, well, I live in a place where people don't know generations of my family. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew who everybody was, and you were called Ray and Madeline's daughter, or you were, somebody's grandpa was running this store, and that's how you knew who they were, and your childhood nickname stayed with you forever. You never were able to outgrow them because somebody always knew them. So that, too, we've lost. And then I heard somebody say recently, well, we're all indigenous to Earth. And I thought, okay, I can live with that. So I can get to know the place that I'm in the best I can. And maybe some places I can know very deeply. And there is no going back. And in a way, it is also that sense that everybody will have of losing what they knew. Because if I were to go back to that same place, the house that I grew up in is gone. Every sign of there ever being a house there, except the road that leads from the little main road over the ditch, goes in there so that a farmer can get to his or her field. But it's all gone. All the trees are gone. It's not the same. And that's also the result that we will have because we live in a world of climate change and ecosystem loss. So it won't be the same.
I found it difficult to live in Chicago, where I was in school for many years. And there was a point where I really had to give up that stubborn resistance that this was not going to be my place, right? Always I was hearkening back, oh, someday I'll get to go home someday. And I think that's probably not a healthy stance to take. I like that phrase, we are all indigenous to the earth. My friend James Amadon and I are doing a course for leaders, and really the focus at the moment is learning how to love place. And what we're trying to help people to think back about those places that they love the most, and then to find ways to extrapolate from their experiences of love of place and bring them forward to the places that they are now. So we know it's possible to belong to place. Now, can we say, is it possible to be in this new place that I'm in? What about those early experiences that helped me to love place? Can I actually translate to this new context? We'll see if that works. It's sort of experimental, but we're helping people to really find practical ways to reconnect and to belong to place. We are finding that inevitably, invariably, it has to be very intentional, it has to be very patient, it has to be very humble, because you can't just go out and learn place in a moment. You've got to spend time there. It's akin to a relationship really with another person. If you want to build a good relationship, how do you do that? What are the things that you actually do? That means spending time, it means listening, it means learning their histories. So there's so much I think we can do in terms of reconnecting to place, even if it isn't the place that we necessarily want to be. We often are in those situations.
I love that. I love that you're doing that. And I was smiling to myself as you were saying that, because I was thinking, like, if it's back to a place that you grew up in, what did you do to get to know it as a child? You were down in the dirt, right? You're not sitting looking out your window with an idle curiosity about what's this like. You were hands-on, picking up the bugs, probably eating some of the dirt, walking in mud puddles, stepping through the creeks, whatever it was that got you there. I was just thinking, like, wow, would we consider ourselves too above that now to really go back to that level of getting to know?
Our listeners are a pretty practical bunch and very interested in how values and ideas get expressed in real-world contexts. Could you tell us more about the community that you lead, called the Church of the Wild Two Rivers? And maybe what are some of the ways that the people in that community seek to live in a more creation-connected way?
So it's a group that I started about 5 years ago. And I want to be clear that we don't intend to supplant anybody's regular church or anybody's practices. We want to support them and offer additional opportunity. So my experience in being in kind of traditional church is that it was pretty much indoors and not really as much as I needed about being outside in the world and connecting. And earthcare meant taking stands, which were important, but not necessarily the kind of things we've been talking about today, about the level of connection that has come to be really important for me. So we meet once a month, and we meet for a couple of hours. And what it provides for us is a community of people with whom we can practice being with a community of earth creatures. So we meet outside, and we connect to each other, and we connect to a theme. And then 40 minutes is really silent wandering. I call that the sermon. 40 minutes is silent wandering, usually with a question or two that I or whoever is leading will throw out that you can consider or not. And then we come back from that 40 minutes in silence, and we come back into that 40 minutes and sit together for a little bit before we share what we've noticed and what we want to take into our lives for the week. It's a very simple format.
In most of our episodes, we tend to end with a question about where our guests are finding hope these days. And in your book, you actually address that question head on, and you offer some really thought-provoking perspectives on hope. For example, you write, it's dangerous to conflate hope with magic. And I wonder what you mean by that.
Well, I was thinking of the magical thinking. I've given presentations on climate change and have people come up and say to me, but there's still hope, right? And I have the sense that what they're asking by that is, we can keep living the way we're going to, and something will cause that to be okay, and my children will be able to live in the same way that I've lived. That's what I think gets defined as hope sometimes. That feels like magical thinking to me. I personally just don't see how that is possible. So I think of it as a continuum because it's just easier for me to think of hope that way. And on one end of it is this like, oh my, Forrest, everything will be just fine. Just go on about your business. I'm going to put solar panels on my house, and so I no longer have to worry about CO2 emissions. Now, we've got solar panels. Let me be clear. I am not saying don't put solar panels on. Absolutely go for it. What I'm saying is the idea that then if we do these 3 or 4 things, we will somehow be able to keep going the way we're going. Feels like it's mythology. The other side of that is to say, I'm going to live in desolation. Nothing is going to improve. We're all going to die. The world is imploding, and we might as well give up. And I don't actually believe that. I think even if I did, I would say it's not a healthy way to live, but I don't actually believe that's true. That's my continuum. There's a lot of places you can choose. So where I choose is to say, we create our own stories. What is the story that I want to be telling about hope, that I want to live into? And the one that I'm living into is to say that there is far more than we know. That Earth is wiser, Earth has agency, Earth has a lot of vibrancy, and is working in ways to heal herself and others beyond what we can understand or comprehend. So that's going on, that we're held in the broadest cosmic community of a web of love, and that's beyond what we can possibly understand. And if I can work what is mine to do, first of all, I have to discover what that is, right? But if I can really discern my piece, and you can discern yours, and other people can discern theirs, and we would all live into that. That's that soul journey to me. We can discover what that is and live into it. Then we entrust that we will be moving in a right direction that may provide some stepping stones for people in the future, a path that others can follow and build on. It's those seeds that we won't live to harvest, but they may provide sustenance for somebody in the future. For me, it's this combination of the long view and a sense of individual contribution and a sense of being part of a whole that's far greater than I can possibly understand.
We've been in conversation with Leah Rampy, author of the new book, Earth and Soul, Reconnecting Amid Climate Chaos. To learn more about Leah and her work, go to the show notes for this episode at earthkeepers.online. The Earthkeepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast, or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website, or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. James Amidon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Meggerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.